Back in the summer of 1996, I went camping with a group of friends at a remote spot in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. I was 28 at the time, and we were all looking forward to a weekend of good food, hiking, and catching up away from the chaos of our everyday lives. This wasn't my first time camping in the area, but it was the first time we'd picked this specific spot. A secluded stretch of forest about a mile hike from the nearest road. The campsites were well-defined but primitive, which was exactly what we wanted. It felt like you could be miles from anyone. I arrived late Friday afternoon. The sun was already starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. My friend Sarah and her husband, Mike, had arrived a few hours earlier and were setting up their tent when I got there. I remember walking into the site, all smiles, excited to see them and get the weekend started. But as soon as I stepped into the clearing, I felt it. Something wasn't right. Sarah shot me a wide-eyed look, the kind of look that instantly told me to stay alert. Mike was standing near the tents, stiff as a board, and not far from him was a stranger. He was tall and wiry, with long, greasy hair and a scraggly beard. His clothes were stained, and he looked like he hadn't seen a shower in weeks. He gave off this odd vibe, like he was trying too hard to seem friendly but just came across as unsettling. Sarah sidled up to me and whispered under her breath, "He's been hanging around since we got here. Won't leave us alone." I nodded subtly, trying not to make it obvious I was clued in. Mike was handling the conversation, keeping things polite but distant. The guy introduced himself as Paul and said he was camping nearby. He'd apparently wandered over when he saw Sarah and Mike setting up. He claimed he was just looking for some company, but from the way Sarah kept glancing at him, I could tell he'd already overstayed his welcome. As the evening wore on, more of our group trickled in. There were 6 of us in total: me, Sarah and Mike, our friend James, and another couple, Ellie and Tom. By the time everyone arrived, it was nearly dark. We all pitched in to get dinner ready. A spread of grilled chicken, roasted veggies, and some fresh bread Ellie had baked. It was one of the things we always looked forward to on these trips. A meal that felt like a feast, even in the middle of nowhere. But Paul was still there, hovering at the edge of our campsite like a stray dog. At one point, he brought over his cooler and proudly showed us his dinner plans. A single steak floating in bloody water, along with a couple of beers. It was both gross and sad, and while I felt a pang of pity for the guy, I couldn't shake the unease he stirred in me. When we finally sat down to eat, Paul dragged over a muddy folding chair and plopped himself down like he was part of the group. His presence cast a weird shadow over the meal, and the conversation felt forced and stilted. After dinner, Mike finally took him aside and politely but firmly told him we'd come here to spend time as a group and needed our space. To my surprise, Paul seemed to take it well. He nodded, said he understood, and wandered back toward his campsite. For the first time that evening, we all felt like we could breathe again. We built up the fire, passed around a bottle of whiskey, and settled into the easy rhythm of laughter and storytelling. But the peace didn't last long. An hour or so later, as we were all sitting around the fire, Paul reappeared. This time, he didn't say anything as he stepped into the circle of firelight. He just stood there for a moment, watching us. Then he sat down, pulling his knees up to his chest. That's when we noticed the gun. It was massive. Later, James would say it looked like a desert eagle. Paul held it loosely in one hand, his finger resting dangerously on the trigger. My stomach turned to ice. No one said a word. We just stared at him, the fire crackling in the silence. After what felt like an eternity, Paul broke the tension. "Anyone want to check out my piece?" he asked casually, holding the gun up like it was a toy. James, ever the quick thinker, shook his head firmly. "No, thanks," he said, his voice calm but firm. Paul shrugged, almost disappointed, and stood up. "All right," he said. Then he turned and walked back into the woods, disappearing into the darkness like a ghost. We didn't speak for a long time after he left. The air felt thick, like it was pressing down on us. Finally, someone muttered, "What the hell was that?" The night dragged on. We tried to go back to laughing and chatting, but it was forced. Around midnight, we noticed a glow through the trees. It was Paul's campsite, and the fire he'd built was huge, flames leaping into the air like he'd poured gasoline on them. From where we were, we could see his silhouette moving erratically around the fire. At first, we thought he was dancing, but as we watched, it became clear he was stumbling, almost flailing. At one point, he tipped a gas can over the fire, sending a tower of flames into the sky. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The flames died down, and Paul vanished from sight. None of us slept much that night. I lay in my tent, every little sound setting my heart racing. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves. It all felt like him, lurking just out of sight. By morning, Paul's campsite was empty. The fire was cold, and the only sign he'd ever been there was a melted plastic gas can lying in the ashes. We debated whether to pack up and leave, but in the end, we decided to stay. We'd come all this way, and no one wanted to let one weird guy ruin the trip. The rest of the weekend was tense. We stuck close to camp, keeping an eye out for any sign of Paul. But he didn't come back, and by the time we packed up to leave on Sunday, it almost felt like a bad dream. Almost. As we hiked back to the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd dodged a bullet. Literally, Paul had been more than just a lonely camper. There was something deeply wrong with him, and while he hadn't hurt us, I couldn't help but wonder what might have happened if things had gone just a little differently. To this day, I still think about that weekend. I've been camping dozens of times since, but I've never gone back to that spot. I don't know what became of Paul, and I don't want to know. All I know is that for 2 nights in the summer of '96, we shared the woods with a man who was far more dangerous than the bears and the snakes and the storms. And that's the kind of fear you don't forget. In the summer of 2012, I went on a camping trip in the Stanislaus National Forest just outside Yosemite with my girlfriend, Claire, and another couple, Josh and Megan. We were all in our mid-20s and had been planning this double-date camping trip for weeks. Josh and I had grown up camping, and we'd promised the girls an amazing weekend by the river, away from the noise of the city. We found the campsite online. It was in a gorge, nestled at the bottom of a steep, winding dirt road that took almost an hour to navigate. The road itself was nerve-wracking, with sharp turns and loose gravel, but the views as we descended were incredible. The gorge was deep and lush, with the river snaking through the center like a silver ribbon. The sheer remoteness of it appealed to us. No crowds, no noise, just the 4 of us and the wilderness. When we reached the bottom of the gorge, there were 2 campgrounds along the river. The first was right at the base of the descent, and it was nearly full, kids playing, people laughing, and the sound of RV generators humming in the background. It wasn't exactly the peaceful escape we had envisioned, so we decided to drive another mile or so down the dirt road to the second campground. When we pulled in, the difference was stark. This campground was completely empty. Felt eerie at first, but I brushed it off. We wanted solitude, and here it was. The site we chose was right between the dirt road and the river. A thick patch of sagebrush and scrub separated the site from the riverbank, offering a bit of privacy. We set up camp in the fading light, pitching our tents and unloading supplies. As we worked, we noticed a few odd things. On the fire pit's metal grate, there was a large rat trap tied to it with a length of rope. It seemed strange, but we joked about it, figuring someone before us had a rodent problem and left it behind. Down by the river, we found a set of clothes, a pair of underwear, socks, a shirt, and pants, laid out on a log to dry. There was no one else around, and the clothes looked weathered, like they'd been there for days. We made a few jokes about some poor camper losing their wardrobe but didn't dwell on it. By the time we finished setting up and got a fire going, the sun had set, and the gorge was cloaked in darkness. The only sounds were the crackling fire, the gentle rush of the river, and the occasional chirp of crickets. We cracked open a few beers and settled in, the warmth of the fire and the company of friends making the strange discoveries from earlier seem unimportant. I sat facing the road, my back to the river. Claire was next to me, while Josh and Megan sat across the fire. We were swapping stories and laughing when I heard it. Footsteps coming from behind me, from the direction of the river. At first, I thought I'd imagined it, but the sound grew louder, deliberate, like someone was walking through the sagebrush towards us. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice cutting through the laughter. The footsteps suddenly quickened, turning into the unmistakable sound of boots running through the brush. Everyone froze. I jumped to my feet, still holding the axe I'd been using to chop firewood earlier. My heart was pounding as I turned toward the sound, expecting to see someone burst through the bushes. But there was nothing. We grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the river, the beam cutting through the darkness. The sagebrush swayed slightly in the breeze, but there was no sign of anyone. The footsteps had stopped as abruptly as they'd started. We stood there listening. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet, as if it was holding its breath along with us. Then we heard it, a faint snap, the sound of a stick breaking underfoot. It wasn't far off, just beyond the reach of our flashlight. I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't an animal. I've camped enough to know the difference between a person's movements and an animal's. Whoever or whatever it was, they were standing out there in the dark, watching us. "Let's go," I said, my voice low and firm. In a flurry of motion, we doused the fire, threw our gear into the back of my van, and climbed in. My hands were shaking as I turned the key, the engine roaring to life. I hit the gas, the van lurching forward as we sped down the dirt road, away from the campsite. We didn't stop until we reached the first campground. Even though it was crowded, we didn't care. The noise and lights felt safe, a barrier against whatever had been lurking in the dark. We parked and sat in the van for a long time, trying to make sense of what had happened. Was it just some other camper messing with us? But why hadn't they said anything or revealed themselves? And why had they stopped running the moment we stood up? The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but none of us slept much. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard those footsteps, the way they'd rushed toward us, then stopped. The next morning, curiosity got the better of me. Against my better judgment, I convinced Josh to drive back to the second campground with me. The girls stayed behind, not wanting to set foot near that place again. When we arrived, the site was just as we'd left it. The ashes of our fire were still smoldering faintly, and the sagebrush around the site swayed gently in the morning breeze. We walked toward the river, scanning the ground for any sign of what, or who, had been there the night before. That's when we saw it. In the soft dirt near the edge of the sagebrush, there were footprints. They were large, unmistakably human, and they led from the riverbank to our campsite. But what made my stomach churn was the way they stopped abruptly just a few feet from where we'd been sitting around the fire. There were no tracks leading away, no sign of anyone retreating back toward the river. It was as if whoever had been there had simply vanished. We didn't stay to investigate further. The memory of those footsteps, the way they'd rushed toward us, was enough to make my skin crawl. We got back in the van and drove away, leaving the gorge behind for good. To this day, I don't know what happened that night. I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just another camper playing a prank, or maybe we scared them off when we stood up. But the way those footsteps stopped, the silence that followed, and those tracks leading nowhere, it doesn't add up. I've been camping countless times since then, but I've never gone back to that gorge. Something about that place felt wrong, like we weren't supposed to be there. And whoever or whatever was out there that night, I have no desire to meet them again. I was 12 years old when it happened. It was the summer of 1983, and my family had decided to go camping in the mountains of northern Colorado, just a few hours from where we lived in Wyoming. Camping trips were a regular part of my childhood. Nothing fancy, just us, the tent, the old '76 Ford Country Squire, and the endless wilderness. This particular trip started off just like the others. We set up camp in a small, primitive site tucked away near a stream. The road to get there was rough, narrow, winding, and barely maintained. It seemed like the kind of place no one but us would bother to find. That was how my dad liked it, though. He always said the farther out you went, the better the adventure. The first day passed quietly. My parents sat by the fire, sipping coffee from tin mugs, while my brother and I explored the stream, hopping over rocks and looking for frogs. The air was crisp and clean, with that fresh piney scent I still think about sometimes when I close my eyes. It was our kind of perfect, simple, peaceful, away from everything. That night, it got colder than I expected. Even inside my sleeping bag, the chill seeped in, biting at my fingers and toes. I woke up shivering, the kind of deep, bone-shaking cold that made it impossible to fall back asleep. I remember fumbling in the dark for my flashlight, its weak beam barely lighting up the inside of the tent. My brother, Tom, was sprawled out next to me, snoring lightly. I decided to go to the car to warm up. The thought of climbing into the back seat, curling up under the blanket we'd left there, sounded like heaven. I grabbed my sleeping bag and tried to sneak out quietly, but as I crawled over Tom, he stirred awake. "Where are you going?" he mumbled, groggy and half asleep. "To the car," I whispered back. "Go back to sleep." But of course, Tom never could resist following me. He insisted he needed to pee, which I knew was just an excuse to tag along. He was 9 and had this habit of trailing after me like a shadow. At the time, it drove me crazy, but looking back now, I guess it was just the way siblings are. By the time we unzipped the tent and stepped out, the first hint of dawn was creeping into the sky. The air was frigid, the kind of cold that makes every breath feel sharp in your chest. I looked toward the horizon, expecting to see the faint glow of the rising sun, and there it was, a reddish-orange light casting a faint glow across the tops of the mountains. I was tired and cranky, not thinking clearly, so I pointed it out to Tom. "Look," I said, "the sun's coming up." Tom squinted at the light, then looked at me like I was an idiot. "The sun doesn't rise over there," he said matter-of-factly. I was directionally challenged as a kid, always getting lost, never knowing which way was which, so of course I argued with him. We bickered for a few minutes, our voices carrying through the still morning air, until we woke up my dad. He poked his head out of the tent, ready to tell us off for making noise, but then he saw it too. The glow wasn't the sun. It was too red, too flickering, and it was spreading. "Fire!" my dad muttered under his breath. Everything after that happened so fast it felt like a blur. My dad shouted for us to grab our stuff, his voice tense in a way I'd never heard before. My mom stumbled out of the tent, her face pale with panic. We didn't pack up properly. There was no time. My dad collapsed the tent with everything still inside, shoving it into the back of the station wagon along with our other gear. The smoke reached us before we even got in the car. It wasn't thick yet, but you could smell it, acrid and sharp, the kind of smell that clings to your clothes and your hair. The air felt heavier, harder to breathe. My dad told us to get in the car, and as soon as we slammed the doors shut, he floored it. The road out of the campground was a nightmare. It was narrow and steep, with sharp turns and sheer drop-offs on one side. My dad drove as fast as he dared, but every bump and skid made my heart leap into my throat. I sat in the back seat with Tom, clutching my sleeping bag like it was a life raft. The glow of the fire was visible through the trees, flickering like some kind of living thing. The smoke was getting thicker, making it harder to see the road. My mom kept glancing back, her face tight with worry, while my dad gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. We hadn't been driving long when we saw headlights coming toward us. It was a game warden's truck, barreling down one of the side roads that led to another campground. The warden pulled up beside us, his lights flashing, and rolled down his window to talk to my dad. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I could see the tension on my dad's face as he nodded. When he got back in the car, he told us the warden was evacuating the area and that we were ahead of the fire, but not by much. That didn't make me feel any better. The smoke was getting worse, and the fire seemed closer with every passing minute. The road twisted and turned, each curve more treacherous than the last. I couldn't stop imagining the car skidding off the edge, tumbling into the abyss below. At one point, we hit a patch of loose gravel and the car fishtailed. My mom let out a sharp gasp, and my dad swore under his breath as he fought to regain control. The tires caught and we kept going, but my heart was racing so fast I thought it might burst. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, we reached the main road. The smoke was still thick, but the fire was farther behind us now. My dad didn't slow down until we were miles away, the glow of the flames no longer visible in the rearview mirror. We drove all the way home that morning, none of us saying much. I think we were all too shaken to talk. When we finally pulled into the driveway, I felt a wave of relief so strong it nearly brought me to tears. Looking back, that camping trip changed the way I saw the wilderness. It wasn't just a place for adventure and fun anymore. It was dangerous, unpredictable, something to be respected and feared. Even now, decades later, I can still smell the smoke and feel the cold air biting at my skin. And every time I see footage of people fleeing wildfires, that memory comes rushing back, vivid and terrifying, a reminder of how small and powerless we are in the face of nature's fury. It was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip. My dad's friend Mark had asked me to come along. Mark wasn't your usual family friend. He was a cop, tough, quiet, and always seemed like he knew more than he let on. But he liked being outdoors, and when he suggested camping deep in the woods, I thought it might be a good chance to hang out with him for a few days. We set up camp in a spot that was far from any main trails, deep in the woods. It was just Mark, me, and his big German shepherd, Rex. The first day went fine, nothing strange. We sat by the fire, ate some food, and talked a little. Mark didn't say much, but he seemed relaxed, like the woods were where he felt at peace. That night, though, things started to feel a little strange. It was late, and the forest around us was silent, which wasn't odd for a forest at night. But every once in a while I heard something, like a stick snapping or leaves rustling. At first I thought it was just animals, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But then Rex started acting weird. He sat perfectly still, his ears up, eyes locked on the darkness just beyond the firelight. I didn't say anything. Mark barely seemed to notice, just patting Rex and quietly telling him to settle down. But something in the air felt off, like something wasn't right. It wasn't any noise or sight. It was just a feeling. Around midnight, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I left the campfire to use the bathroom. As I walked into the woods, it felt strange, like the trees and shadows were watching me. I hurried, finished what I had to do, and started walking back to the camp. That's when I heard it, footsteps. Slow, steady, coming from behind me. They weren't too close, but they were definitely there, walking at the same pace I was. I turned around, expecting to see Mark or Rex following me. but there was nothing. I froze for a second, trying to see through the dark, but I couldn't make out anything. The feeling that someone or something was watching me got worse. I didn't want to stick around to find out. I rushed back to the camp, heart pounding in my chest. When I got back, Mark was still by the fire, his eyes scanning the trees. Rex was growling low, his body tense. Mark didn't say anything, but when he saw me, he gave a quick nod. It wasn't until then that I realized how tense the air had become. It wasn't just the normal night sounds. Felt wrong. For the rest of the night, we didn't speak much. The only sound was the fire crackling, but it didn't ease the tension. Mark kept his eyes on the forest, and Rex didn't stop growling. The deep, low growls would stop and start, making the hairs on my neck stand up. Every now and then, I'd swear I heard something moving out in the trees, but I couldn't see anything. By morning, the unease was still there, but we packed up quickly. Mark didn't say much. He kept his gun close, checking the trees before we left. I didn't ask any questions. I didn't need to. When we finally reached the truck, Mark sighed and muttered, "You're safe now." It wasn't comforting. Felt more like a warning. But I didn't ask anything. I didn't want to know. As we drove away, I looked back at the woods. The trees stood tall and quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching us. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks, but it felt too real, too intense. It was like we weren't supposed to be there, like the woods were meant to be left alone. And I was sure deep down that Mark knew it too. I never went camping again after that. I don't think Mark ever talked about it again either. But every time I pass by that area, I get the same feeling. That sense that something is watching me. And it's not just a feeling anymore. There's a part of me that knows there was something out there, something that wanted us gone. And if we had stayed any longer, I'm not sure if we would have made it out at all. That place, it wasn't meant for anyone. And whatever was out there, still waiting just beyond the trees. It had been raining nonstop all day. Not the kind of light rain that you can ignore, but the heavy, steady rain that soaks everything. But I wasn't about to give up. I had set up camp deep in the woods in Northern California, far from any roads or houses. The air felt fresh, and even though it was raining, the place felt calm. I figured the storm would be gone by morning, so I set up my tent and stayed inside, eating a hot meal. The rain pounded on the tent like a constant drum, and the wind howled through the trees. At first, it was peaceful, but after a while, I started feeling uncomfortable. The woods, usually full of sounds, were completely quiet except for the storm. No leaves rustling, no animals moving around, just the rain falling heavily. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound I couldn't ignore. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I realized it wasn't. It was footsteps, soft but clear, crunching through the wet leaves outside. I froze. My heart started pounding. The footsteps weren't too close, but they weren't far either. They circled the tent slowly, almost like they were testing it, seeing if I was really inside. I wanted to scream out, to say something, but something held me back. The air felt thick, like something was watching me. I knew I had to stay quiet and hidden. The footsteps moved away for a bit, and I thought maybe it was just an animal. But then they came back, this time closer. The soft crunching grew louder, deliberate, like whoever it was taking their time. The rain grew heavier, the wind picking up, but I couldn't breathe right. My body was frozen. I couldn't move. The sound of someone or something moving around my tent was too real. I held my breath, hoping it would stop. But then, I heard something I wasn't ready for. A low tapping on the side of the tent. Slow, rhythmical. Someone was tapping on the fabric, like they were testing it, trying to see if I would react. My heart raced. I put my hand over my mouth to stop myself from making a sound. I didn't know what to do. Should I stay still and hope it passes? Or should I make a run for it? The rain outside was loud enough to cover any noise, but the tapping got louder. It felt like someone was right on the other side of the tent, just inches away, knowing I was inside. I don't know how long the tapping went on, but it felt like forever. Finally, it stopped. I could still hear the rain, but the footsteps were gone. There was no more tapping, no more sounds. I waited a few more minutes, just listening to the storm. When I thought it was safe, I finally built up the courage to peek out of the small window in the tent, just enough to see outside. Everything was quiet. The rain was still coming down hard, but there was no sign of anyone. No footsteps, no movement. I slowly crawled out of the tent, my hands shaking. I looked around the campsite, scanning the trees, but there was nothing. The woods were still, like they had never been disturbed. I checked my gear, making sure everything was in place. Nothing seemed out of place, but I didn't trust it. Something felt off. I packed up my stuff quickly, feeling the weight of something watching me. I knew I couldn't stay there any longer, not with the way I felt. I had to trust my gut. Something was wrong. As the rain started to ease up, I broke down camp and started heading back through the woods. The air had a strange chill to it, and the woods, which had felt so alive before, now felt empty. Too empty. The only sound was the soft drip of rain falling from the trees. But I didn't stop. I just kept moving, not looking back. When I finally reached my car, I breathed a sigh of relief. The fear started to fade a little, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there, watching me. I glanced back at the woods one last time, but there was nothing. No movement, no signs of life. But as I got into my car and drove off, I couldn't get rid of the feeling. My eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror. I couldn't shake the thought that I wasn't alone. Something had been out there in the dark, moving around my tent. And whatever it was still watching me. I knew that I wasn't done with it yet. It wouldn't let me forget. The woods had their eyes on me, and they weren't going to let me walk away so easily. I was spending the weekend at my grandma's village, camping by the edge of the woods. It was quiet, even quieter than usual, just the sounds of crickets and the wind moving through the trees. My tent was set up not far from a small stream, and I had everything I needed: a warm sleeping bag, some snacks, and a flashlight. As the sun went down, the village became even more still, the kind of stillness that feels heavy, like something is watching. I've always liked it here: Grandma's house, the small village, the woods. It was a good break from the busy city life I usually have. The night wasn't too cold, so I just lay in my tent, watching the shadows from the trees stretch across the ground. Everything felt fine until I heard it. A noise, a soft scraping sound, right outside my tent. I froze, trying to listen more closely. It stopped for a moment, then started again, this time a little louder. I sat up, my heart racing, and grabbed my flashlight. It flickered at first, but I managed to get it on. I slowly unzipped the tent, being careful not to make too much noise, and peeked outside. Nothing, just trees and the stream moving by. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding and turned back to the tent. Then, just as I was about to zip it back up, I heard it again. The scraping noise, this time much closer. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing. It didn't sound like an animal, it was too controlled, too deliberate. I moved to the opening slowly, my hand shaking as I shined the flashlight around the camp. The light caught something near the edge of the trees, 2 red dots, glowing in the dark. My stomach sank. I quickly turned off the flashlight and backed into the tent, trying to stay calm. Whatever was out there wasn't moving. It felt wrong, like I wasn't alone, like something was watching me. I couldn't stop my hands from shaking. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening to the thudding of my own heart. The rustling outside didn't stop. It was like something was circling my camp, moving just out of sight. I kept telling myself it was probably just an animal, but I wasn't sure anymore. Every crack of a twig or shift in the bushes made my heart race faster. Was it a person, an animal, or something worse? I didn't want to find out. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under, but I didn't sleep well. Every little sound made me jump, my eyes snapping open in the dark. I kept my flashlight close, just in case I needed it. Morning finally came, weak light creeping through the trees. The woods looked different in the daylight, less threatening, but still uneasy. When I got out of the tent, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The ground around my camp was scratched up, long, deep marks, like something had dragged its claws through the dirt. There were no footprints, no sign of a person, just those marks. It had been close, too close. I grabbed my stuff quickly and decided it was time to go. The village had been peaceful for the most part, but something about the woods felt wrong now. I didn't feel safe. I didn't know what it was. Maybe a wild animal, but the way those marks were made didn't seem like anything I had ever seen. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't an animal. The worst part was that I knew it had been watching me. It had been right there, close enough to scrape the dirt like that. I wasn't sure what I had seen in the dark, but I knew it was something I didn't want to find out. I stayed inside my grandma's house after that, not even bothering to look back at the camp. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I never went camping there again. Every time I think back on it, I can still hear that scraping sound. And now, sometimes, when I'm walking in the woods, I feel like something's just behind me, waiting to get close enough again. I've learned not to ignore that feeling. It's still out there, and next time it might not stay in the dark. I had been camping alone for a few days in the woods of Northwest Virginia. The weather was perfect, quiet, just the kind of peace I loved. The only sound was the wind in the trees and the occasional rustle of leaves. I liked the calm. The nights were cool, and I sat by the fire until late, watching the flames and trying to clear my mind. But on the third night, something felt off. At first, I couldn't figure out what it was. The air felt colder, even though the forecast said it would stay mild. I shook it off, thinking it was just the cool night air. But then I noticed something even stranger. The forest was completely silent. No crickets, no owls, no wind. It felt wrong, like the woods were holding their breath. I tried to ignore the feeling and went to bed early. But sleep didn't come easy. Every little sound had my heart racing. Branches cracking, leaves rustling, footsteps. It felt like something was getting closer. I told myself it was just animals, but the sounds were too clear, too close. Then I heard the snap of a twig, followed by complete silence. I couldn't lie to myself anymore. I had to check it out. I grabbed my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, and stepped out of my tent. The air was even colder now, and my breath came out in short bursts. I moved quietly around the camp, trying to figure out what was happening. Every time I took a step, I heard something shift in the bushes, like someone was moving just behind the trees. Whoever, whatever, was out there wasn't trying to be sneaky. I wasn't imagining it. I slowly crept back to my tent, hoping whatever it was would just go away. But it didn't. I heard something moving around my stuff, my food, my gear, even brushing against my backpack. It wasn't an animal. Animals didn't do that. My stomach tightened. Whoever was out there knew exactly what they were doing. I stayed still, listening, praying the sounds would stop. But then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps getting closer to my tent. My heart hammered in my chest, and I tried not to breathe too loud, afraid whoever was out there might hear me. The footsteps stopped right next to my tent. I could feel my pulse in my throat. Whoever it was standing right there, not moving. I knew I couldn't just wait. I had to do something, but every part of me screamed to stay hidden. The rustling started again, and I could hear something brushing against the fabric of the tent, moving closer. I reached for my flashlight, my hand shaking so bad it was hard to hold on to it. I turned it on. The beam of light cut through the dark, and I saw him, a man maybe in his 40s wearing dirty clothes. His face was pale, his eyes wide open, staring at me. There was something in his eyes that I couldn't understand, like he wasn't really seeing me, but at the same time like he was studying every move I made. He was standing less than a foot from my tent, just staring. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't move. I didn't know what he wanted, but I knew I was in danger. I didn't have anything to defend myself with, and he was too close for me to do anything. I just kept my eyes on him, praying he wouldn't come inside. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the woods. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. It was so quiet, it felt like the entire world had just stopped moving. I didn't dare go outside to check if he was still out there. I stayed in my tent, shaking, wondering if he was watching me from the darkness. The night dragged on and I barely slept. My heart was still racing, and every tiny noise made me jump. When morning finally came, I packed my things quickly, barely taking the time to make sure I hadn't left anything behind. I didn't care about the campsite anymore. I just needed to get away. I walked all the way to the ranger station, the whole time feeling like someone was following me. Every rustling in the woods made my skin crawl, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, waiting for me to make a mistake. By the time I reached my car, I was exhausted. The chill from the night still hadn't left me, and the memory of that man's cold, empty stare stuck with me. I never looked back as I drove away, and I never went back to those woods again. A few weeks later, I heard something strange. A hiker had gone missing in that same area, and they found his gear abandoned just like mine had been. But the strange part? His tent was still set up, and it looked like it had been used, like someone had been there living in it. I never went back to that part of the woods, but I often wonder, who else is out there now? Or worse, what is?